But I am really fascinated with decomposition. This is my manly man photograph. When I was 19, 20 years old, I suffered from testosterone poisoning. A lot of you young men, and for that women also, you do dangerous things. So the most dangerous job in the world was being a logger setting chokers. So I go, well, that's for me. So I did that, and then 3 guys in my crew got killed. And they wanted to make me the hooker. That means the top dog on the crew. And I decided to go back to college. So one mushroom resident in the old growth forest is called Agarikon. It is Fomitopsis officinalis. It's the longest living mushroom in the world. It's a perennial polypore. The Amadou grow for 3 or 4 years. This grows for up to 100. These are annual growth rings. I was very interested, and have been, in Agarikon. I wrote several articles. And then National Geographic, gave me a Green Innovator Award. And they were fascinated by my interest in this rare mushroom called Agarikon. Now, my dear professor, Michael Bugh, who I showed a photograph of, he goes out in the old growth forest 20 times a year. He found his first Agarikon last year. That's how rare it is. And he's an expert. So finding Agarikon is not easy. When you do find it in a valley, oftentimes there are satellite colonies and other trees, as one would expect. So National Geographic wanted to do a story on me on a search for Agarikon, so they could send a photojournalist out. And we decided, well, why don't we go up the inland passage of Desolation Sound in British Columbia? And they said, well, we don't want you to take us to a site where there's already an Agarikon. We want to find a new one. I don't know. Well, National Geographic, I'm like, great, they're coming out. Oh, bad news, they want to find a new Agarikon. And they said, well, how likely will we find it? And I go, oh, 50-50, maybe. But reason for that is we got a motor sailor, in a Zodiac, went up the Desolation Sound, and these things look like giant beehives, and where bald eagles are in trees, oftentimes you find Agarikon. So you look for a living snag, bald eagles, and so I took 10 of my friends, high-powered binoculars, and we scanned the horizon. Now, we left at like 7:30 in the morning, and by 11:30 at night, we're going up, in that morning, 4 hours later, we're going up Desolation Sound, and we have retina burn. Because, look at the tree there, nothing there, tree there, nothing there, tree there, nothing there. You do that hundreds of times, and you're like, dizzy. And so the photojournalist was getting pretty impatient. Paul, you promised me. And I said 50-50, dude, So we're going along, and so our skipper said, this is not doing too well. It's lunchtime. Let's go over to a First Nations site where there's some interesting pictographs. We don't know what they mean, but let's go over there and have lunch. Now, this is a 30-foot overhang. You could bring canoes, or a boat right up into this flat area. It's, used to run red with salmon. The perfect place to get out of the weather and also have access to the water and fish. So we're motoring over there, and then Jimmy, one of our colleagues, goes, there's one. And sure enough, we found one. This is amazing because this Agarikon was attached to an upper limb. It fell, it hit this limb, it teeter-tottered, then it regrew its mycelium back into the tree, and then it grew 2 legs. So it was a really extraordinary Agarikon. We got really excited about this, going, wow, this is great. So, the photojournalist was really excited. So we're there, and there's an interesting legend with the Haida people and other first Northwest coastal First peoples about the origination myth of women. And with the Haida culture in particular, this is Raven, and she's traveling on a canoe in the Sea of Eternity, and no one can help Raven succeed in finding her genitalia. She is sexless at this point, except one person in the back of the canoe can help her, and is known as Fungus Man. And it's either Agarikon or the Artistkon. There's 2 different competing theories for this, but these are Agarikons that are carved and placed on as grave guardians upon shamans' graves to help them go into the afterlife. So Agarikon was not only revered by Dioscorides in Greek culture, but with the Haida and the first peoples will also realize that it was a very important medicinal ally, and spiritually so as well. So Gujau is the president of the Haida people. I felt it was my mission to bring back the knowledge of Agarikon back to the Haida. There was 2 smallpox pandemics. Some people call it the first bioterrorist acts of the United States government against indigenous peoples, where they purposely gave smallpox infected blankets, and they didn't even have to fight these warriors. They could walk in the village the next day, in the next year, and they would be dying of smallpox. So Gujao, and this is the artist conch is the other one that may have been this fungus creature in the back of the canoe, because the artist conch you can draw a map on, and it would make sense that, well, you're in a canoe, you need to find your genitalia, you need a map to it, so why not draw it on the artist conch? So we don't really know whether it's Agarikon or the artist conch, to be fair here, but there's 2 competing myths or candidates for supporting the origination myth of women in the Haida culture. So Dr. Scott Franzblau, supported by the Gates Foundation, the director of Tuberculosis Research Institute, University of Chicago, read one of my articles, got real excited, and said, Paul, I want to come with you. So this is actually one of the pictographs at that site. And there's 2 wide-eyed, and it's very similar. You know, it's made with salmon eggs, by the way, and painted, but it's faded a lot. So Scott was real excited and said, you know, I read about Dioscorides and Agarikon being used as treatment against consumption. Paul, we think consumption was tuberculosis. I'm a tuberculosis expert. I'm the head of this tuberculosis research laboratory. I want to travel with you. So Scott and I teamed up. Now, this is classic pharmaceutical discovery with natural products. You take a plant, you take a mushroom, and it's called bio-guided fractionation. And basically, you have a water, the most polar of solvents. You use water, and then you use the least polar solvent, like hexane. And hexanes will pull out lipids, and water will pull out proteins and polysaccharides. Well, you have 2 different solvent extractions, and now you test both of them. Which one showed more activity against tuberculosis? It's a decision tree. Oh, this one over here did. And then you fractionate it again. And then you go, okay, which branch of that fractionation increased potency against tuberculosis? That's a classic way that drugs have been discovered from natural products. So we did this over 4 or 5 years, and sure enough, Dr. Scott Franzblau, Guido Pauli, and myself and other colleagues, we found 2 novel anti-tubercular compounds called chlorinated coumarins, highly active against XDR-TP, multi-drug resistant strains of tuberculosis. So we published in the Journal of Natural Products. It was a classic pharmaceutical discovery path. Got very excited about it, but we, in a sense, confirmed what our ancestors knew, that Agarikon seemed to help against tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis was not resident with the Haida people, North Coast Indians, nor with flu viruses, nor with smallpox. So Gujao's people, when he said, Paul, if we knew about Agarikon, we would have used it, but you have to realize, in 40 years, we had 4 pandemics that killed 75 to 95% of the elders and the people in his tribe. So the thread of knowledge was cut, from their ancestors.
By the time the British colonies were established in North America, the Native American population was only 10% of what it had been. 90% of American Indians were killed by Old World disease. That's the equivalent of aliens exploring Earth only to fight a group of survivors, a mere shadow of what they used to be. Now, I'm not saying Native American people all had gleaming cities, well, some did, but it's often overlooked just how much disease played a part into Europe's conquering of the New World. Using alternate history, we ask a question: what if disease had not wiped out the Native Americans? How would interaction with the Americas go? Well, here is one scenario.
Now, first I'd just like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people on whose land we're meeting. But we should also remember all past Indigenous peoples from Sydney Cove all the way to the Kimberleys who suffered from the onslaught of white settlement. So now, as most of us will know, in April 1789, a catastrophic epidemic of smallpox swept through local tribes near Port Jackson. This was a time when Aboriginal tribes were actively and successfully resisting settlers from the First Fleet. This outbreak was recorded by several fleeters, for example David Collins, and he wrote, "Early in the month and through its continuance, The people whose business called them down the harbour daily reported that they found, either in excavations of the rock or lying upon the beaches and points of different coves which they'd been in, the bodies of many of the wretched natives of this country. Aboriginal oral history has probably always known that the British were responsible for smallpox. However, it was Noel Butlin who famously brought this to the attention of the wider community. In 1983, Butlin wrote, "Smallpox could have been used deliberately as an exterminating agent. It is possible and quite likely the British deliberately opened Pandora's box." In 2001, Dennis Foley published an example of oral history. According to Foley, the oral tradition reported that at Balmoral there were blankets with red markings, a stripe of words or a crown, and that those who took the blankets died a horrible death of fire under the skin and the pus of 1,000 festering sores. This oral history is particularly useful because it can be corroborated independently. The description of a stripe of words or a crown is similar to navy blankets of the era. Examples as replicas can be seen today at the National Maritime Museum in Sydney, which is on this slide. First Fleet blankets would have had lettering from the symbol of George III that was branded on government property. The description of fire under the skin is accurate, as it is also the description given by those who suffered smallpox elsewhere. In 2009, Michael Bennett concluded that smallpox was released from the First Fleet, but he suggested this was a deliberate act by rogue Marines or convicts. Where I differ from Bennett is that a close examination of the circumstances suggests that some official authority, not necessarily involving Governor Phillip, ordered the deployment of smallpox when local tribes were possibly poised to overrun the settlement and win the first frontier war against invaders. We can be confident that the spread of smallpox was officially authorised because, as we saw earlier, it occurred on the opposite side of the harbour from the settlement and down the harbour at Balmoral. This indicates that boats were used for smallpox deployment, which would have required official planning and sanction, because any Marines leaving Sydney Cove without permission were court-martialled. From what we've just gone through, it is clear that the disease was certainly smallpox, that it was certainly released from the First Fleet by someone with authority to take boats out of the harbour, just when the Marines were running out of ammunition, and when they were running out of manpower, and just when it looked like they were about to lose the first frontier war. This was obviously a deliberate act by the British, as proposed by Noel Butlin over 30 years ago. And here endeth the story.